When Paul Walker walks into Sunset Manor nursing home wearing worn jeans and carrying a simple bouquet of flowers, the arrogant head nurse immediately assumes he's just another drifter looking for trouble and demands he leave before he disturbs the residents. But what she discovers about why Paul is really there, and the secret he's been keeping for months, will leave everyone in that facility absolutely stunned and prove that the deepest acts of love happen when no one is watching. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The afternoon sun casts long shadows through the windows of Sunset Manor Nursing Home, a modest facility on the outskirts of Van Nuys, where the city's forgotten elderly spent their final years. The building showed its age, paint peeling around, the window frames, a parking lot with more cracks than asphalt, and an overall atmosphere that spoke of limited budgets and stretched resources. But inside, despite the worn furniture and dated decor, something beautiful was happening. Families visited, nurses cared, and lives continued with dignity even in their twilight. Behind the reception desk sat Margaret Richardson, the head nurse, a woman in her mid-50s who wore her authority like armor. Her crisp white uniform was always spotless, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression carried the permanent severity of someone who had seen too much heartbreak and learned to protect herself by building walls. Margaret had worked at Sunset Manor for 12 years, and in that time, she'd developed an unfortunate talent for judging visitors before they even opened their mouths. Margaret prided herself on maintaining order in what could easily become chaos. 83 residents, most with dementia or other conditions that required constant attention, didn't leave much room for disruption. She'd learned to spot trouble from across the lobby. Family members who showed up drunk, estranged relatives looking for money, or worse, strangers with unclear intentions who somehow thought a nursing home was an appropriate place to wander through. The automatic doors whispered open, and Paul Walker stepped inside, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wore faded jeans with honest wear marks, a simple navy blue Henley shirt, and work boots that had clearly seen their share of actual work. In his left hand, he carried a small bouquet of daisies. Nothing fancy. The kind you'd pick up at a grocery store for $5. His hair was slightly tousled from the afternoon breeze, and stubble shadowed his jaw. Paul paused just inside the entrance, taking in the atmosphere of the place. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something that reminded him of his grandmother's house, a combination of lavender and old books and the particular warmth that comes from a place where people have lived long lives. He could hear the distant sound of a television playing an old movie, the soft conversation of residents in the day room, and the gentle efficiency of staff, members going about their work. Margaret looked up from her paperwork, and her expression immediately shifted from neutral to suspicious. Everything about Paul screamed problem visitor to her trained eye. The casual clothes, the cheap flowers, the way he seemed to be studying the place like he was casing it. Margaret had dealt with too many people who showed up at nursing homes with bad intentions. Thieves looking for easy targets, scam artists, or family members who only appeared when they needed something. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who expected immediate compliance. "Can I help you with something?" Paul approached the desk with a calm smile. "Good afternoon. I'm here to visit someone." Margaret's frown deepened. "Visitor's name?" Paul hesitated for just a moment. "Paul? Last name?" Margaret pressed, her fingers hovering over the computer keyboard. "Walker," Margaret typed in the name, but her expression remained skeptical. "And who are you here to see?" Paul's smile remained gentle. "Rose Martinez, room 34. Margaret's expression immediately hardened. Rose Martinez was one of their most vulnerable residents, 92 years old, advanced dementia, no family, no regular visitors. If someone was targeting Rose, Margaret would shut it down before it started. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Margaret said, her tone becoming more authoritative. "And I'll need to know your relationship to Mrs. Martinez." Paul reached for his wallet, but Margaret was already studying him with obvious disapproval. Actually, before we go any further, I need to ask, what exactly is your business with Mrs. Martinez? Paul blinked, slightly taken aback by the hostility in her voice. I visit her, we talk. Margaret's expression grew more skeptical. You talk? Mrs. Martinez has advanced dementia. She hasn't had a meaningful conversation in over a year. Paul's voice remained calm. I know about her condition. I still visit. Margaret crossed her arms, her suspicion now fully activated. And how exactly do you know Mrs. Martinez? Paul hesitated again, and Margaret interpreted this as confirmation of her worst fears. She'd seen this before. Strangers who showed up claiming to know. Residents, usually with ulterior motives. Look, Margaret said, her voice rising slightly to ensure nearby staff could hear. I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but this is a nursing home, not a public park. We don't allow random people to wander around bothering our residents. Paul's expression remained patient, though something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but disappointment. I'm not bothering anyone. I just want to visit Rose. Margaret stood up, her full authority now on display. Sir, Mrs. Martinez is a vulnerable, elderly woman with no family. She's exactly the kind of person that predators target. So, I'm going to ask you one more time. What is your real relationship to her? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Several staff members had stopped their work to watch the confrontation, and a few residents in wheelchairs near the lobby looked over with curious expressions. Paul stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the public humiliation. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but carried weight. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Margaret's jaw tightened. The only misunderstanding is you thinking you can walk in here and take advantage of defenseless people? Paul looked around the lobby, seeing the faces of staff and residents who were now watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. When he looked back at Margaret, his voice was calm but firm. I've been visiting Rose Martinez every Tuesday for 8 months. She may not remember my name, but she remembers kindness. She remembers that someone cares enough to sit with her. Even when she can't respond. Margaret's expression didn't soften. That's a touching story, but I've never seen you before, and I know every regular visitor in this facility. Paul's voice grew quieter, but more pointed. Maybe that says more about how often you actually spend time with the residents than it does about me. The words hit Margaret like a slap. She felt her professional composure cracking, her authority being challenged in front of her staff. I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. Paul nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this. And Rose, who's going to sit with her today? Margaret's face flushed with irritation. Mrs. Martinez is well cared for by our professional staff. She doesn't need visits from strangers with questionable motives. Paul looked at her steadily. Everyone needs visitors, Margaret. Everyone needs to know they're not forgotten. The use of her name, spoken with such quiet certainty, caught Margaret off guard. How did he know her name? And why did his voice carry such conviction when he talked about Rose? Before Margaret could respond, a soft voice called out from across the lobby. Paul? Is that Paul? Everyone turned to see Agnes Murphy, an 87-year-old resident in a wheelchair, rolling herself toward them with surprising speed. Her face was lit up with genuine joy, her eyes bright with recognition. Agnes, Paul said, his face breaking into a warm smile. How are you feeling today? Agnes reached out and grasped Paul's hand with both of hers. Oh, I'm wonderful now that you're here. Rose has been asking about you all morning. Margaret stared at the interaction, her certainty beginning to waver. Agnes was one of their most mentally sharp residents, and she clearly knew this man well. Agnes, Margaret said carefully, how do you know this gentleman? Agnes looked at Margaret as if the question was absurd. This is Paul, dear. He visits Rose every week, brings her flowers, reads to her, holds her hand when she gets scared. Haven't you seen him? Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. No, I haven't. Agnes patted Paul's hand affectionately. He's an angel, this one. Rose lights up every time he arrives, don't you, dear? She looked at Paul with obvious affection. Paul's cheeks reddened slightly. I just sit with her, Agnes. Nothing special. Nonsense? Agnes replied firmly. You treat her like she matters, like she's still a person, not just a collection of symptoms. Margaret stood frozen, watching this exchange with growing horror. She was beginning to realize that she'd made a terrible mistake, but she still didn't understand the full scope of what she'd done. A young nurse named Carmen approached hesitantly. Excuse me, Mrs. Richardson, Paul is here for Rose. He comes every Tuesday like clockwork. He's been coming for months. Margaret's face went pale. smile. Why wasn't I informed? Carmen looked confused. I thought you knew. He always signs in, brings flowers, never causes any problems. The residents love him. Paul looked at Margaret with the same calm expression he'd maintained throughout the encounter. I sign in at the side entrance, he said quietly. I usually come during the afternoon shift change. I never wanted to bother anyone. Margaret felt her world crumbling around her. She'd just publicly accused a regular, beloved visitor of being a predator. But worse than the professional embarrassment was the growing realization of what she'd almost prevented. Paul, another voice called out, and they all turned to see Harold Chen, a 90-year-old veteran in a wheelchair, approaching with a big grin. You're early today. Harold rolled up and extended his hand for a shake. Agnes told me you were coming. Rose has been looking forward to it all day. Paul shook Harold's hand warmly. How's the physical therapy going? Harold? Harold flexed his arm proudly. Better every day thanks to you encouraging me. The therapist says I'm making remarkable progress for someone my age. Margaret watched in stunned silence as more residents began to notice Paul's arrival. A woman with a walker made her way over slowly, her face brightening when she saw him. An elderly man in a recliner waved enthusiastically from across the room. It was clear that Paul wasn't just known here. He was loved here. He was part of this community in a way that Margaret, despite working here for 12 years, had somehow completely missed. Carmen, the young nurse, stepped closer to Margaret. Mrs. Richardson, Paul is amazing with the residents. He spends hours here not just with Rose, but with anyone who wants company. He never asks for anything, never wants recognition. Some of our residents only have him. Margaret's throat tightened. She looked at Paul, who was now surrounded by elderly residents, all of them clearly delighted to see him. He spoke to each one individually, asking about their health, their activities, their concerns. This wasn't the behavior of someone with ulterior motives. This was the behavior of someone who genuinely cared. I owe you an apology, Margaret said quietly, her voice barely audible over the conversations around them. Paul looked at her, his expression free of anger or resentment. You were protecting them, I understand that. Margaret shook her head. No, I was judging you based on how you looked, based on assumptions I had no right to make. She gestured around the lobby at the residents who were still gathering around Paul. These people, they're precious to me. I've spent 12 years taking care of them, and I thought I knew everything that went on here. Paul's voice was gentle. You do take care of them, but maybe caring is bigger than just medical needs. Margaret nodded slowly, the truth of his words settling over her. How long have you been visiting Rose? 8 months, Paul replied. I started coming after I heard about people in nursing homes who don't have family. Rose doesn't remember my name, but she remembers feeling safe. That's enough for me. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. Why Rose specifically? Paul's expression grew more serious. Because everyone deserves to know they're not alone, and because, he paused, choosing his words carefully, because I know what it's like to lose people you love. I know how important it is to have someone who cares, even when everything else is fading. The simplicity and honesty of his answer hit Margaret harder than any accusation could have. She looked around at the residents who were still chatting excitedly about Paul's arrival, and she realized something profound. She'd been so focused on protecting them from bad people that she'd almost driven away one of the good ones. Agnes rolled her wheelchair closer to Margaret. Dear, Paul doesn't just visit Rose. He reads to whoever wants to listen. He plays cards with Harold. He helps Linda with her crossword puzzles. He makes this place feel less like a hospital and more like a home. Margaret looked at Agnes, then at Paul, then at the gathering of residents who were all waiting patiently for their turn to talk with him. I had no idea. Carmen stepped forward again. Mrs. Richardson, Paul also does something else. He brings personal items for residents who don't have family. Last month he brought Mr. Henderson a new pillow because he noticed his old one was too flat. He brought Mrs. Garcia a heating pad for her arthritis. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. How did I miss all of this? Paul answered gently. You work the morning shift. I usually come in the afternoons, and I never wanted to disrupt the routine or cause extra work for anyone. Margaret felt a crushing weight of realization settling over her. This man had been quietly, consistently bringing joy and comfort to her residents for months, and not only had she failed to notice, she'd just tried to throw him out. Paul, she said, her voice thick with emotion, I don't know how to apologize for what just happened. Paul looked at her with the same kindness he'd shown throughout the entire encounter. You don't need to apologize to me. You were doing your job, but maybe, he paused, looking around at the residents, maybe there's a way we can work together to make this place even better for them. Margaret nodded, feeling something shift inside her. What did you have in mind? Paul smiled. Why don't we start with me? Officially introducing myself. I'm Paul Walker, and I'd like to volunteer here regularly if you'll have me. Margaret blinked. Paul Walker, as in... Agnes laughed from her wheelchair. Oh dear. dear, you didn't know. Our Paul is quite famous. He's in movies." Margaret's mouth fell open as the recognition hit her. Paul Walker, the actor from The Fast and the Furious, had been quietly volunteering at her nursing home for 8 months, and she'd just accused him of being a predator. But Paul held up a gentle hand. "That doesn't matter here. Here, I'm just Paul, someone who cares about people like Rose." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of her mistake, but also by the grace with which Paul was handling it. "Mr. Walker, I don't know what to say." Paul's smile was genuine and warm. "How about we go see Rose? I brought her favorite flowers." As they walked down the hallway toward Rose's room, surrounded by residents and staff who were all clearly devoted to Paul, Margaret reflected on what had just happened. She'd been so focused on protecting her residents from strangers that she'd almost driven away someone who was making their lives immeasurably better. When they reached room 34, Paul knocked gently before entering. "Rose, it's Paul. I brought you some daisies." Margaret watched through the doorway as Paul approached the bed where a tiny, frail woman lay propped up against pillows. Rose Martinez might not remember Paul's name, but when she saw him, her face transformed. The fear and confusion that often clouded her eyes gave way to something beautiful. Recognition, not of identity, but of love. "Hello, beautiful," Paul said softly, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling today?" Rose reached out with a trembling hand and Paul took it gently in both of his. She didn't speak. She rarely spoke anymore, but her eyes stayed fixed on his face with complete trust. Paul began talking to her in a low, soothing voice about his week, about the weather, about nothing and everything. He arranged the daisies in a small vase on her bedside table, adjusting them until they caught the light just right. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching this scene with tears in her eyes. This wasn't a celebrity making a charity appearance. This wasn't someone looking for recognition or tax deductions. This was simply a man who understood that every person, regardless of their condition, deserved to feel valued and loved. As Paul read to Rose from a book of poetry, his voice gentle and patient, Margaret realized that she'd learned something important about both judgment and grace. She'd been so busy protecting her residents from people who might hurt them that she'd almost missed recognizing someone who was healing them. After an hour, Paul kissed Rose's forehead gently and promised to return next week. As they walked back down the hallway, he stopped to chat with other residents, listening to their stories, sharing in their small joys and concerns. "Paul," Margaret said as they reached the lobby, "I want to formally invite you to volunteer here, officially, with full access, a volunteer badge, and my complete support." Paul smiled. "I'd be honored." Margaret paused, then asked the question that had been bothering her since the moment she realized who he was. "Why here? Why a place like this? You could volunteer anywhere, support any cause." Paul looked around the lobby at the residents who were still waving goodbye to him, their faces brighter than they'd been when he arrived. Because these people have stories, they've lived full lives, loved deeply, contributed to the world, and now, when they need care and companionship most, too many people see them as burdens instead of treasures. He paused, his voice growing softer. "And because when you've lost people you love, you understand how precious it is to have someone who cares enough to just be present." Margaret nodded, understanding flooding her heart. "Thank you for being patient with me today, and thank you for seeing what I somehow missed." Paul extended his hand for a shake. "Thank you for caring enough about them to be protective. That's exactly the kind of person I want looking after Rose and the others." As Paul left Sunset Manor that afternoon, Margaret stood in the lobby watching him go. She realized that she'd witnessed something rare and beautiful. Not just an act of celebrity charity, but a genuine example of what it meant to love without recognition, to serve without expectation, and to see the humanity in people that society too often overlooks. 6 months later, Paul's weekly visits had become legendary at Sunset Manor. Word had spread quietly through the community about the actor who spent his afternoons reading to elderly residents, and the facility had received several significant donations from people inspired by his example, but Paul never took credit for the increased support. He continued to arrive every Tuesday afternoon with flowers. For Rose, in time for anyone who needed company, he'd become not just a volunteer, but a part of the Sunset Manor family. Margaret had changed too. She'd learned to recognize that love came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important visitors were the ones who didn't look like they belonged. She'd also learned that her job wasn't just about protecting residents from harm, but about helping them experience joy. On one particular Tuesday, as Margaret watched Paul help Harold with his physical therapy exercises, while Rose napped peacefully with fresh daisies on her bedside table, she reflected on the lesson that had changed everything. Never judge someone's heart by their appearance, because sometimes angels come in worn jeans and work boots, carrying $5 flowers and priceless love. The residents of Sunset Manor were living proof that the most beautiful acts of service happen when no one is watching, and that the the deepest impact comes from consistency rather than grandeur. Paul Walker had taught them all that celebrity meant nothing compared to compassion, and that the most important role anyone could play was simply showing up for people who needed to know they weren't forgotten, because in the end, Rose Martinez might not remember Paul's name, but she would always remember the feeling of being loved, and sometimes that's the most important thing anyone can give another human being.